Alright guys, so let's talk about BRICS today. The summit is in full swing, and it's Russia's big show to snub the West that Putin isn't isolated and the global south stands with Russia. Now, there are a lot of interesting side events that happened prior to the summit and during the event. Modi hugged Putin and reaffirmed Russia-India strategic partnership. Now, just in trade alone, it makes sense. India has saved billions of dollars buying cheap crude from Moscow. Now, what's interesting is China and India resolving the border dispute. And this is bad news for the US, which likes to pit India against China. It's, however, great news for BRICS. It shows that the two biggest economies in BRICS can indeed work together. Very soon, we'll see more economic movement, and eventually, even the Belt Road Initiative could be welcomed by India. In the 2024 summit, Russia's agenda is focused on financial sovereignty, how to make BRICS an independent bloc that can function without the Western system. And let's focus on what Putin said to reporters just before the summit. He reminded the world that de-dollarization is actively happening. 95% of Russia's foreign trade with its partners is being carried out in national currencies. 95% of our trade with China is in ruble and yuan. We also use the yuan in settlements with third countries. This is the first point: settlements in national currencies. Bypassing the dollar in transactions is really a big deal. Countries are no longer constrained by the amount of dollar reserves they have to conduct trade. So even if the Federal Reserve they raise interest rates, there won't be a sudden rush to acquire dollars for trade. You avoid a currency crisis where domestic inflation soars to the moon. We just need to look at Chinese trade. Beijing is the biggest exporter to the world, and they manufacture essentially everything. Countries are beginning to realize, why do I need to use dollars to buy and sell stuff with China? In the first 8 months of this year, China's total cross-border payments in RMB have increased by 21%. The majority of China's trade settlements are done in the local currency. This is something we mentioned before. The first and easiest domino to fall will be countries de-dollarizing their trade with China. It's a big reason why Beijing has to keep their exports high despite being accused of overcapacity. In the financing of global trade, China has dethroned other popular currencies. The dollar is still king with nearly 84% market share, but the Chinese yuan is around 6%, beating the euro and even the Japanese yen. For Russia, they are happy to elevate China's currency as long as it weakens the dollar. Now, the second objective is to establish a payment system. It's completely different from de-dollarization, and we must understand the difference to prevent any confusion. During the interview, Putin mentioned how BRICS they are working to create a platform for financial information exchange. It's a mechanism that's an alternative to the Western SWIFT system. The SWIFT system today is a Western control architecture. It has been around for over 50 years and it powers global financial transactions. When Russia was banned from it in the short term, it caused quite a bit of chaos. Your banks, stock exchanges, corporations, and pension funds, they all require SWIFT to do business. So if you transfer funds from the US to Hong Kong or Dubai, it has to go through the system. The challenge BRICS faces is how international payments are being controlled by commercial correspondent banks, and the biggest ones are either US or EU commercial banks. So if Yellen tells them to ban transactions with Russia, they have to enforce the ban or face US sanctions themselves. And let's say there was a widget maker in the US and they want to send money to a supplier in Russia. The US company has an account in JP Morgan, for example, and they want to wire $1,000 to their vendor in Moscow. They will have to go through a correspondent bank, BNP Paribas in France, for example. BNP will then convert the dollars into rubles and send the money to the Russian bank located in Moscow. But thanks to G7 sanctions, Russia can't use the SWIFT system anymore. There are multiple identity checks on both the sender bank, JP Morgan in this case, as well as the correspondent bank, which is BNP located in Paris. They cross-check the information on the SWIFT registry and they block any transfer to Russia. This is the threat of financial sanctions because the entire network, especially the banks, is almost completely Western. Any country can get cut off. And that's why Russia and China they are building an alternative system. In February, Russia unveiled the platform they are building. It's called the BRICS Bridge System. It will be powered by blockchain technology, and that's essentially translate the entire framework into a black box that's sanction-proof. Instead of commercial banks in the middle, the system will use central banks. They will be at the center of cross-border transactions. So instead of going through a G7 correspondent bank, the transactions will be from central bank to central bank. For example, the Bank of Russia to China's PBOC or India's RBI directly. No intermediary is necessary. All currency exchange and transactions will be done and cleared through the blockchain network. So countries like China, they can still use their dollar surplus for trade. While the BRICS are changing the world order, we have quite a stunning report from a major US bank. The US markets might be in serious trouble. According to Goldman, the decade of big S&P gains is over. We can expect annualized nominal returns of 3% for the next 10 years. As an investor, this is very concerning. The US market has been so overpriced that going forward, it will hardly outpace inflation. The lost decade for US stocks could be coming soon. Now, since 2015, US stocks have been on a tear. It has returned 13% a year in the last decade. And if we compare it to the rest of the world, the US market has been outperforming everything. In 2023 and 2024, the US outperformed the world by over 10%. In 2021, it was up by 21% versus the global average. But let's remember how ridiculous valuations are. US stocks are expensive because of a few things. Now, firstly, the US still holds the reserve currency. And when the world holds dollars, the stock market is one avenue where money piles in. Second, let's not forget the AI hype. We have records amount of money piling into the Magnificent Seven, and this is inflating the bubble, making US stocks very overvalued relative to the world. And here's how ridiculous things are. Over the last 40 years, the US economy share of global GDP has been declining. From 40% in the 1980s down to 26% today. The EU and Japan's economies have also been falling. Conversely, China's economy has been rising up from under 5% to nearly 17% in the same period. But the global stock market is dominated by the US. Over 60% of the total global market cap belongs to US companies. Goldman is sounding the alarm bells on this. The amount of risk in the US equity markets is enormous. Now, we're not saying that US stocks will crash tomorrow, but valuations are so high that we shouldn't be surprised if we get an underperformance for the next decade. Just take a look at historical PE ratios. We are at 36 price to earnings today, and that's higher than the Great Depression crash and just below the dot-com collapse in 2000. Just before the big correction in 2022, PE ratios were around 38. Now, can this continue to climb? Sure, but it would mean the US government spending a ton of money to prop things up. But as we know, the world order is getting flipped. As BRICS rises and trades amongst themselves, this isn't good for the US economy. If less trade flows to US companies, correspondingly earnings will come down, and that puts enormous pressure on US stock prices. It will collapse the fundamentals, and let's not forget what's coming in 2025. Trump's trade war is coming.
You're also talking about 10-20% tariffs on the rest of the world. That is going to have a serious effect on the overall economy. And yes, you're going to find some people who will gain from individual tariffs. The overall effect could be massive in terms of the economy.
I agree it's going to have a massive effect, positive effect. It's going to be a positive, not a negative.
Well,
let me just I know how committed you are to this, and it must be hard for you to spend 25 years talking about tariffs as being negative and then have somebody explain to you that you're totally wrong. It'll have a negative. It will have. I'll go a step further.
40
if
million,
you don't
40
do
million,
this,
President
this
Trump,
country
40 million jobs is a lot of jobs to rely on.
They're all coming back.
Now, Trump's tariffs won't be good for the US economy. Countries around the world, especially China, would retaliate back. While it's true that tariffs can raise revenue, it could also collapse US GDP at the same time. The problem with reshoring production back to the US is the amount of pain this will cause. Prices will rise in the United States. Consumers could face price hikes of up to 5%, and that's over 2 years of nominal inflation hitting your budget all at once. For the average household, their purchasing power is going to decrease. They will lose up to $7,600 a year. If consumers spend less, company earnings are going to come down. And that will obviously impact the US stock market, making staff back in the US. Well, it sounds really great, but it will likely become a closed economy, especially when the world retaliates with their own version of tariffs. The Tax Foundation has revealed some shocking estimates. Trump's proposed tariffs could reduce GDP by almost a full percentage point. In addition, almost 700,000 jobs could be lost. And when people lose their jobs, spending is definitely going to crater. These numbers don't even factor in retaliation from China and even the EU. If we get a global trade war, it won't just be consumption in the US that will drop. Global consumption of US goods will also collapse. Countries like China will push their people to buy locally made products. There's simply no way to restore production without conjuring up an economic crisis. It's not a surprise why US stocks could underperform in 2025 or even collapse. Should the tariffs happen, the retaliation from the world could be enormous. Now, what if the US borrows even more money to prop up the economy? This is one big question that everyone can ask. Well, that's definitely possible, but it would push us to the brink of a debt crisis. The interest payments on the debt is equivalent to 18% of federal income. For every dollar the US government brings in, 18 cents goes off to paying off just the interest on the debt. It's unsustainable. If Trump wants to reshore production without getting into a recession, he will have to increase the fiscal firepower. Then this number could fly up to 20% or even 30% when all said and done. Now, I know that I sound like Dr. Doom, but there are very few options for happy ending. Either the US have a very big slowdown in 2025 or maybe even a recession, or we crank up the borrowing and get an enormous melt up. It's important we understand how China, Russia, and BRICS all fit into this mess. As the global south grows, as they build their own financial system, more trade will be done outside of dollars. Foreign governments today own around $8 trillion in US bonds, and that's 23% of total outstanding debt. But just 2 decades ago, it was over 50%. Foreign demand has been falling for a very long time. It's just more obvious today, especially after the sanctions on Russia. So we gotta watch carefully what China and Russia do. The BRICS payment system is just the start. More transactions will be done outside the reserve currency. And if Trump really hammers the world with tariffs, then it's game over. But let me know what you think. Can BRICS replace SWIFT with a new financial system? And can the US economy continue outpacing the world forever? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.